This is ContraZoom,
where we go back and forth about film.
I'm Dakota Arsenault.
And I'm Rachel Ho.
Today's episode is another installment of Make, Remake. It's where we take a movie and its remake and compare the two. Not to see which one is necessarily better or worse, but to see how two movies can tell the same story both similarly and differently. In the past, we have paired such films like Ikaru, Cape Fear, The Tragedy of Macbeth, Dune, and more. On today's show, we are considering the 1951 film The Day the Earth Stood Still, directed by Robert Wise, and the 2008 remake directed by Scott Derrickson. If you have not seen at least one version of this movie, be warned that there will be plenty of spoiler talk in this episode. Joining the show today to talk about the two films is Brody Cottenham, a screenwriter and friend of the show who was last heard on our bonus episode, Oscars 2023, Oscar Draft, back in March, where alongside Alex Watson, the four of us drafted our picks for what movies would win the most Oscars. Brody crushed us all, and his prize was picking a movie for the loser, in this case, Rachel, had to watch. Brody picked the 2008 version of The Day the Earth Stood Still, and we decided to make a whole episode about it. Welcome back, Brody. How are you doing? And can you please talk us through your reasoning for picking this movie to torture Rachel with?
Well, for starters, I picked a movie that I didn't think would get me banned from the show. Because I could have gone a lot of different ways. And it was actually Rachel's idea to do the Make Remake. Because I picked the classic one. And then I think I had posted that I'd found, because I bought a copy, actually shortly before the Oscars, I found a copy and realized that Rachel had never seen it because she commented on the tweet I had or something like that. And then when it came time to pick, I decided, hey, this is a really good classic movie that you haven't seen. And I mean, as much as you kind of tease and poke fun about, like, we wanted to torture the loser and stuff, if you had lost, yeah, I probably would have picked Halloween, but it's like, you wanted to pick a good movie. Like, maybe you guys are more, sadistic than me, but I wasn't trying to be mean-spirited about this. And I wanted to pick something that I genuinely thought Rachel would enjoy. So that was kind of the thought process there. Once I knew she hadn't seen it and I knew she was a fan of sci-fi, it just seemed like a great choice.
And it stars Keanu Reeves.
Yes.
So have you seen both of these movies prior to suggesting this and prior to this episode, or are you just seen the remake?
No, I'd seen the original.
Okay. Oh, you hadn't seen the remake. Oh,
yeah.
Gotcha.
So it was the original that I wanted Rachel to watch. And then, like I said, she's like, oh, why don't we do this? Because this would be fun to discuss both. And so then I've seen the remake a couple times since then, as well as rewatching the original.
Nice. Okay. And what about you, Rachel? Had you seen either of these movies before? And if not?
Nope. As Brody said, that was kind of the whole deal with him. Well, actually, no, Brody's a nice guy. He didn't pick a movie that I would have hated, which, I'll be honest, Brody, I probably would have done that. Let's be real now. I would have picked something that I thought just would have been excruciating for somebody else to watch. But no, I had never seen, I actually, that's not true. So I thought I hadn't seen either of them. And then, this sounds terrible, but like an hour into watching the new one, the 2008 version for this episode, I was like, oh, I've definitely seen this movie before. But it took me an hour into an hour and 40-minute movie to realize, no, I have seen this before. So at some point, I'm sure, because it's Keanu Reeves, so it doesn't surprise me that I have seen it. But I'd never seen the original before, though, no.
Fair enough. Did you know about the original movie before, or like was this completely minor racing happening after watching the remake and not even remembering that?
No, I knew about the original just in the place of, sorry, what am I trying to say? I knew the original because it is kind of a bit of a hallmark for sci-fi movies, right? Like it is a touchstone film in that genre. So just because I like that genre a lot, I knew about it, but just had never kind of made the time to watch it.
Fair enough.
Instead, I decided I'm going to watch the Keanu Reeves version, obviously.
Obviously.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the science fiction short story Farewell to the Master was written by Harry Bates and was released in 1940. In 1951, it was adapted to be a movie by writer Edmund North. Director Robert Wise, most known for the original West Side Story and The Sound of Music, added an extra layer of believability to the story. In it, a spaceship lands on Earth, and an alien that looks human named Klaatu, played by Michael Rennie, emerges alongside his protective robot, Gort. Klaatu is shot by the U.S. military and taken into custody. Whenever Gort senses violence, he powers up and uses a laser to disintegrate threats and their weapons. Klaatu demands to speak to every leader in the world, but the Americans refuse to comply and keep him locked up. After escaping, he studies humans and reveals his reason for coming to Earth to Helen Benson, played by Patricia Neal. That due to the world creating nuclear weapons that can exit airspace, neighboring planets are worried that they will be attacked next after Earth destroys itself with infighting. Earth's only option is to engage in world peace, or Gort will destroy the planet. The film came out at the height of the atomic age and Cold War fears and lent excessively to the themes of the movie. The movie also helped popularize the use of the theremin as the score to Alien movies by legendary composer Bernard Herrmann of Psycho and Taxi Driver fame. In the remake, directed by Scott Derrickson, who helmed the first Doctor Strange movie, along with The Exorcism of Emily Rose and The Black Phone, updated the alien arrival story for modern audiences. It stars Keanu Reeves as Klaatu and Jennifer Connelly as Helen. This film updates the nuclear fears for environmental ones, as Klaatu explains that if humans destroy the Earth, they also die. But if humans are killed off Earth, Earth will remain and will be a planet other beings could eventually use. While the original film had a subtle religious allegory to it, the remake positions Klaatu as a stand-in for Jesus and his robot companion Gort as a god, unleashing a plague of locusts to remove the human infestation after collecting 2 of every animal for preservation. Both films, for better or worse, address subject matter that were important issues at the time of their release. Before we get into similarities and differences, I'd love to know if you had seen, well, we already talked about this, if you had seen the films, and your thoughts on them. So, Rachel, let's start with you. Did you like these movies? Did you not like these movies? How did you enjoy this experience?
I'll say that I appreciated them more than I liked them, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know if I'll ever go back to rewatch either of them, but the first one in particular, or the original in particular, 1951, I appreciate it a lot. Like, I can really respect it for what it did in sci-fi, and also just generally, like, the idea of not having computer effects and that being, it still being quite a new genre at that point, like, especially in the way that we eventually know it to be. This movie is very seminal in that kind of way. So I respect it a lot more than I think that I sat down and been like, oh, like I would watch this over and over and over again. I don't think I would do that, but I'm glad I watched it though. So thank you, Brody, for that. But I think I enjoyed it a lot more as like just kind of a study in cinema history almost. The 2008 version is all right. I mean, it's not nearly as bad as everybody says it is. I think that that's the thing. Everyone talks about it like it's just the worst film that's ever made, and like how it torpedoed Keanu Reeves' career, which obviously it didn't. I didn't think it was that bad. Like, I mean, that came out at a time when so many of these types of movies that were just going full tilt on CGI and those things, like it's just one of those types of movies to me. And I think they do a good job. We'll get into this, I'm sure, but like, they do a good job of making it different enough from the original version that I can look at it as a kind of like a wholly separate thing.
That's fair. What about you, Brody? What are your thoughts on the films overall?
I really, really like the original. I would agree with Rachel that the new one is not a good movie by any means, but it's also not, this terrible mess that everyone kind of seems to make it out to be. I just think there's a lot of really good parts that just didn't come together well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I had seen the original movie a bunch of times as a kid. That was a favorite movie of my uncle and my dad, so watched that a few times as a kid, and I believe I had watched it at least once more as an adult, so it'd been a little while since I've seen it, but it's definitely a classic that I really enjoy. And Rachel, you're right about like how this was, sort of the beginning of the era of sci-fi films. Obviously, the short story came out in 1940, so sci-fi, hard sci-fi like this, as far as alien invaders and stuff like that, had been out for a little while, but this really was the beginning of that sort of era. That, like, the 1950s really dominated the movies. These, creature features, beings from other planets, mad scientists, all that sort of stuff that really became popular at that time and eventually kind of became all B movies for the most part. It was really refreshing to kind of go back and sort of see the expert abilities of the people at work here. Like, obviously, Robert Wise as the director is probably why this movie is as good as it is. You have to look no further than the other movies that he made to see what a talent he is. And he really doesn't like lean into the schlockiness that I feel like other sci-fi movies of this era leaned into. And then Bernard Herrmann's score is absolutely fantastic. And then there's also, I really appreciate the alien spaceship design, where I was reading into it and it looks like a UFO flying saucer, very typical for that era, but there's no seams on the ship. And then all of a sudden a ramp will appear and the door will open. And what they did was they would cover it in putty and then paint over it. And then when they separated it, the seam would appear all of a sudden, like it came out of nowhere. So it was really ingenious use of technology at the time to make it look more realistic that this spaceship has no seams to it. And I think that's something that's, other movies weren't putting the effort into at the time. As for the remake, I had never seen it before until this time. And I agree with both of you. Like, it's not a good movie. It's also not terrible. I think it's mostly undone by two things. One of them is the Jaden Smith performance. And the other one is I think it goes a little too heavy on the religious allegory. And we're really going to get into that a little bit later because that's stuff I want to talk about. But I think those are the sort of two main downfalls. But I really agree that, both movies focus on the fears of the time, whether it was the Cold War and the nuclear fears versus the environmental fears. I think they're two very good ways to ground your film.
I find interesting because you bring up the Cold War aspect. I was looking at it more of like in the 2008 version, we are 7 years removed from 9/11. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1951 version, you're, I think, 6 years removed from World War II. And that's the kind of that's the place I looked at it within like the context of history. And oddly, I think of the 1951 one as being more optimistic in a way. Like there was a bit more, and maybe it's because the Americans came out on top after World War II, right? Like they effectively quote unquote won the war. But whereas 9/11 was obviously, there are no winners and losers in war, but in that case, they lost. Like it was an attack on their country. And so to me, there was such a different vibe between the two when you're talking about the fate of humanity and like where humans stand at that point, where like in 1951, they're more like, yeah, we can collaborate. We can do this. We can work together kind of thing. And we can, I just felt like there was more of an optimistic feel to it. Whereas in 2008, it was, oh, humans suck. Like we all are just going to tear each other apart. And I was like, it just seemed interesting to me that both of them came out, within 10 years of two very, very large moments in human history, and particularly in American history too.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point because there's several scenes in the original one that shows people coming together. It ends in a delegation of all the big leaders, the religious leaders and stuff like that. You see people of different races and religions and backgrounds sort of that coming together to talk and attend this meeting being held by the scientists who, plead for world peace, basically. And it really does seem a lot more hopeful in that sense. Whereas in the remake, we're not that far from 2008, where I can easily be like, yeah, you're going to tell some people that they need to be nicer to people and they're just going to be meaner. Like, like we don't have to look very far to look at politics of, the world that's going around right now and all the ridiculous stuff that's happening and be like, man, why can't people just be nicer? Please just stop being mean to people.
And and certainly like in our time, 9/11 really did have an impact on everything, like in life. Like if you think about how tense things were, like, even in media, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot because like I love 90s movies so much. And there's such a great joy to 90s, even the downer 90s movies. There's something about them, like the way they're filmed, for example. Like Seven is obviously it's a bit of a downer movie, but the way that it's filmed is very like artistic, very hopeful. There's like a lot of kind of pomp and circumstance around it. But then after 9/11 happens, you see there's a big shift in film, in particular. Like things are not nearly as joyful, even subtly joyful, as they were before then. And I think that we haven't really kind of come out of that stage yet. And we are 20, oh wow, gosh, we're like 22 years off from 9/11. So yeah, I just found that really interesting, like looking at the two from a historical perspective. And I honestly, like I kind of figured the Cold War stuff was going in, and like that was obviously like a really big thing at the time. But that didn't cross my mind as much as saying like, wow, they're like coming together as if almost like a United Nations.
And I think John Cleese's character had a really interesting line in the newer one where he was talking about, people, when you reach the brink, that's when people kind of come together and, you make these decisions and stuff, which kind of gets to what you're saying, Dakota, is like, it was just kind of a downer. Like you had to be pushed right to that edge where you were learning. Whereas in the 1950s one, it was like, okay, here's the problem. What are we going to do about it?
I think that would be another one of my bigger issues with the remake is I really like that idea of John Cleese's thesis statement being like, people only do what's right when they're pushed to the brink. Now, that's unfortunately a very depressing thought, but time and time again, it's shown that that's kind of true for the most part. And they kind of bring that up again near the end of the movie, where they're talking about, hey, no, you have to give us a chance because humans will do the right thing when push comes to shove. And then it just sort of seems like they revert back to more of the religious aspects and kind of remove that point completely. And I really wish that had been like the main, like final, beat, that's what they're focusing the most on, is the idea of, humans are awful people, but, in times of crisis, they will come together and they will do what's right eventually. And so that was one thing that I kind of wish that they had spent a little bit more time emphasizing, and less so the religious angle.
The religious angle's real thick. There's no subtlety about it, is there?
No.
Like it's really, I came across a couple articles and be like, is it an allegory? I was like, yes, of course it is. Like, why is this even a question? Yeah. This isn't a discussion point. Like, it's very, very much so. Like, I mean, you could even borderline say that it is slightly kind of propaganda, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
References to arcs and locusts and go down the list.
They're not subtle about it. Like, they don't try to hide that aspect of the film for sure.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Drew Pearson. We bring you this special radio television broadcast in order to give you the very latest information on an amazing phenomenon: the arrival of a space ship in Washington. The Army has taken every precaution to meet any emergency which may develop. Just a minute, ladies and gentlemen, I think something is happening.
All right, let us get into our similarities, the first half of this portion. So I've got a couple things that I want to say that are similar between the two movies, of how they're able to tell the same story. And then if either of you have anything as well, then we'll kind of discuss those as well. So the first one I want to kind of point out is both movies really highlight the incompetence of the U.S. military in the misplaced idea of ownership. Both films show the military as overly violent and without discipline. And despite being asked to gather world leaders several times, the U.S. refuses to work with other nations, which I thought was a very interesting thing because especially in the 1950s, you're coming out of World War II, as you were talking about earlier, Rachel, and America really took the ball of, hey, we won World War II for the rest of the world. We're the greatest nation on earth. And that was kind of the whole start of a generation there. The greatest generation, quite literally, is what they were called. And so it's sort of interesting to see that, less than a little over half a decade later, they're showing the military being so incompetent and can't even resist, firing upon people without knowing what the actual threat level is, which I thought was very interesting. And I think it's no shock that, people on a certain political spectrum will often criticize countries for not wanting to actually work together. And in this case, it's the U.S. refusing to actually gather all the different political leaders from around the world. And in both times, in both movies, they talk about how, well, let me just address the United Nations then. And it's like, well, no, we can't do that because reasons. And it sort of just feeds into this idea of U.S. superiority and this idea of they're the only ones that can handle this kind of information or this kind of threat level. Was this something that you felt was done accurately or handled well or sensitively for you? Like, let me know what your thoughts are on that point is, either of you.
Yeah, I do agree that I think because they were telling it from the U.S. perspective, that's exactly how it would have been. I think you could have done that from the perspective of any military, because I think that's very much a military thing, right? Like if it would have been, from the Japanese perspective or the Russian perspective or however you wanted to do it, it would have been this idea that, no, we need to control this power because if we don't, our enemies will. And obviously the U.S. being, to your point, especially back then, kind of at the forefront, it was certainly always going to be, this idea of, the U.S. wielding their might and being the ones that would step forward to say, no, we're first in line. We're the ones who'll deal with this appropriately. And I think both movies definitely have aspects of that. Like Kathy Bates's character was basically all but saying, no, we can't trust anybody else. This is our job.
I love how her character at one point, he said, like, I think Keanu goes something about like the world. She goes, this is the United States. It's like, oh no, because he says, like, do you represent the world? Like, do you speak for all humans? She's like, I speak for the president of the United States. I'm like, you think that's the world, don't you?
Sure did.
I think it's, for me, it's less like, I agree with the point that both of them are criticizing the military and maybe the actions of the military. But for me, it's more about just the general idea of war and violence versus the U.S. military very specifically. I think that, like, again, like I already kind of brought up the historical context, but it's like by that point, people are kind of sick of being at war, right? Like we're sick of turning on our TVs and at the time it was the Iraq War, the invasion on Iraq and all that kind of stuff. Like it was so much media at the time. And I think people were just getting sick of it and people were just wanting to move on to a better place in the world where they weren't at war and things like that. And so I don't know if I think that they chose the American military because it's Hollywood. And so they can criticize their own military versus criticizing another country's military is a bit out of pocket. So I think that I agree with that similarity in that they both take aim at military might and maybe even like considering the lack of oversight when it comes to their the consequences to what they do as a military operation.
And I think you see that in the original one too, which another similarity I'll bring up, I don't know if you're going to broach it later, Dakota, but was both of the young boys lost their father who was in the military. Mm-hmm. And so at the beginning or early on in the original, you see Arlington Cemetery, which is just like this massive military cemetery, right? And it gets to that idea that, you are living in this post-World War II era and, the sacrifice in the military and, what that means. And I think it was just handled a lot better, in that it was better written, I'll put it that way. And then in the newer one, it was this idea that, his dad was just trying to help. And, he was killed as an engineer in the military, right? So it is all very much tied into, I don't want to say the pointlessness, but often just, the struggles of military might and, questioning why we do this.
I think it's interesting you talk about the kid, because I think in like 1951, he's very like, my dad like kind of died a hero in a way, like kind of in war. Whereas Jaden Smith he had the more of like, why did my dad leave me kind of thing. And I think both are very valid. Like they both kind of look to, like you said, Brody, the pointlessness of war and just like a different aspect, a different reaction almost from a child's perspective, which I think was interesting. But sorry, Dakota, I cut you off.
That's all good. Yeah, I like the way they handled it a lot more in the first movie because, Klaatu arrives at Arlington Cemetery and he looks over, this entire field of white crosses, white headstones, that sort of thing that are so famous at Arlington. And you sort of feel the reverence of like, oh, he understands this is a cemetery of people that made sacrifices for the greater good. And that's the way the movie implies it. And I think that's handled very well. And then in the remake, I think it mostly has to do with a writing problem as far as the Jaden Smith character goes. And that's not to say that a kid who is very young and loses their father and is left with their stepmother would not have a lot of anger and lash out and not fully understand exactly what happened to their parent and all that sort of stuff. That makes sense on a realistic level. I expect that to be reality. But from a movie perspective, it got pretty frustrating that we would get these scenes of Jaden Smith having these wild outbursts, accusing his stepmom, Jennifer Connelly, of all these horrible things, of how she doesn't love him and how his dad's a real hero and he'd go and kill the aliens and all this sort of stuff. And then we get the next scene of Jennifer Connelly calmly explaining, well, this isn't what actually happened, blah, blah, blah. And then we get another scene with Jaden Smith doing this outburst. And so it was too much of, all we needed was a scene of Jennifer Connelly, being like, your dad wasn't a hero. He was an engineer. He sat behind a computer all day. He unfortunately was caught by an IED or something. I don't know what it is, whatever story they want to make. And that would have sort of helped soften the Jaden Smith character. But instead, they made him so aggressive the entire time. You kind of lose the whole plot point about what is his father supposed to be, the connection to the military and all that sort of stuff, because you just don't care because you're just so angry at this annoying kid. Or at least that's how I felt about it. And it seems like from other reviews that the Jaden Smith character was a big sticking point for people not liking this movie.
Now, how much is it the writing, which I agree with? I think the writing of the 2008 one is not great. But how much is it just his performance generally that annoyed you?
Oh, I think it's both. It's absolutely both, because, you could have a different actor even using a different take of him doing the exact same line readings differently, and it probably would have softened his character a whole bunch. But I think the problem was it was just too often people not taking a moment to explain to him what is expected of him as far as like, hey, I need you to not call the police right now, sort of thing. Stuff like that, where he just kind of does these weird outbursts and lashes out sort of thing, where I think that is where the poor writing comes in, and sort of repeating the scenes of like throwing the same temper tantrum every scene he's in. That's poor writing in my books, because I don't think Jaden Smith was improvising the same scene over and over again. He was like a 7-year-old kid, 6-year-old kid. He wasn't doing that. That was what he was told to say.
But I wonder if you had a better child actor, could it have been a little bit different? Like, could a better child actor have played the notes differently? And like, yes, there's far too many temper tantrums. I agree. But like you said, though, that is relatively realistic. Like, I could see a kid never really understanding the deal until like years later, until they're much older. But in that time period of being like a bit of a brat, I shouldn't say a brat. That's not
he
really
was
fair.
that was the character, and unfortunately, that was the characterization.
Yeah. It's too bad. I don't want to defend Jaden Smith, but yeah, I think he was just given a poorly written character. But I mean, he was a kid, so I don't really want to criticize a child actor too much.
From what I know about Jaden Smith's acting career as well, I would also have to question how much control Scott Derrickson even had on set with him, because there's stories like, I know it sounds funny, but there's stories of like what was that the Shyamalan movie they did where it was the two of them, another After Earth, After Earth it was called, where Will Smith apparently basically directed the whole movie, and Shyamalan basically just sat there and like told the cameras when to roll and when to cut. And so it would not shock me in the slightest if Will Smith was on set with, Jaden on those days and basically not letting Scott Derrickson give him direction.
And he did say, Will Smith has said in recent years after that one, which was like, I shouldn't have done that with that movie. Like, it was After Earth, right? He was like, I shouldn't have done that. But he's like, he kind of realized it then, but I completely agree. He probably was there and was thinking, Will Smith's a fine actor, but I do think he had probably, especially around this time period, that he thought like big dramatic overtures equaled great acting. That was his thing. And so it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest either if we found out like him and Jada are on set doing their thing, trying to get him the best moments, not realizing that like when they all tie in together, it looks really silly.
Yeah. Maybe it's my bias showing. I just don't think it's as well written. I mean, the guy
it isn't.
I forget the name, which is terrible, but the gentleman who wrote the original one, he won the Oscar for writing Patton. and Robert Wise, who I don't think we appreciate how good a director he is. Like, he doesn't get mentioned as much as a lot of other guys, but like Dakota said, like, he's won several Oscars and he's done classics, and like he also did The Haunting, which is like a horror classic. He did this, which is a sci-fi classic. He's done musical. Like, he just has, and he did the Star Trek movie. Like, he just has this huge range. So I think they brought a lot more. And I don't mean that to be smart to Scott Derrickson, because I do enjoy the movies of his that I've seen. I just think that it was a much more grounded and like well-constructed film in the writing of the original. And that, I think it was Bryan Cranston's line. He talked about, like, as an actor, it's like, if I get, B dialogue, I can maybe bring it up to an A- if I'm a good actor. But if I get C dialogue, like, I can't do much with it, right?
Yeah. I like, to Rachel's point, if, say, prime Haley Joel Osment around the Sixth Sense era was cast in this young son role, would he have made that role better and maybe not have? I don't think the movie would have saved the movie completely, but it would have been a little bit more of a bearable movie in the sense of Haley Joel Osment at that age just had such a knack for bringing real gritty emotion to his characters. It probably would have been better. Or, maybe someone like Jacob Tremblay in recent years, something like that. He's a little also more on the whiny side a little bit, but still a much better actor than Jaden Smith ever was, either of them.
I was thinking McKenna Grace. She's my example of when there's a good go-to child actor. I love her. I think she's a grown up. Or is she a grown up now? No, I think she's like a teenager now, but she's not a child anymore, basically. Yeah. But when she was like everything that I ever seen her in, she was just phenomenal. And like, she was so like Dakota Fanning, maybe I think around that period, she would have been, she would have been a kid around that time. Yeah, I agree. I think that it could have been better, but it wouldn't have made this movie like excellent or great. Like, I don't think Jaden Smith is the reason that this movie doesn't work, but it is funny that he is the thing that everybody calls out. And I don't know if that's because of, maybe that is only because of his family, like, because we focus in on him a little bit more because of that. But it is interesting that I think like people come away from this movie and he is a very, very big sore spot of the film. But that might just be because he's a Smith.
And also, you don't want to read anything negative about Keanu, so.
I will defend Keanu in this movie a little bit, slightly, just a little. He was meant to be playing this weird alien. Although compared to, okay, we'll get into it later, but I'm like, in comparison to the 1951, there was another way to do this movie. Sure, there's another way to take that role, but I don't think Keanu was that bad. Just like, I don't think the movie was that bad. Like, everyone talks about this movie being one of the worst things ever made. And I was like, no, it's not. There were far worse movies out there that were coming out at this time.
I will say this about the acting. I think Keanu Reeves is cast to his abilities. So he's supposed to be playing this kind of weird alien that doesn't talk a lot. Keanu Reeves is really good at doing those types of characters. Jennifer Connelly, I love Jennifer Connelly, also is not someone that usually gives you a huge range of emotions. And so she sort of matches Keanu Reeves on like a tempo level of what you're getting. And then you have to contrast that with Jaden Smith, who all of a sudden every scene he's in is giving you a 10 as far as emotional level goes. When you've got Connelly and Reeves giving you like a 4, it really stands out, unfortunately.
Yeah. Jennifer Connelly's role, I feel like it was maybe, again, it's just a time period where many female roles were underwritten, but this is like a main character. But when I look at like Keanu's role, like Klaatu, I think that he is perfectly cast in it. I do think that is a good role for him. Jennifer Connelly, though, I feel like a number of different actors could have played Helen Benson and it would have come out more or less the same. And I do think Jennifer Connelly is a great actress, and I think that she's very distinctive when she's given something great. Like, I do think she can be a very distinctive actor. But this one, I just kind of felt like it was a bit more of a generic thing. Like, you could have given it to a lot of people, and the same result would have happened.
Again, I think that gets back to the writing, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Like, imagine someone like Julianne Moore. I can imagine the performance looking pretty identical given the dialogue.
And they're both amazing actresses too. That's the thing. Like,
absolutely.
So yeah.
All right. Another similarity I kind of want to touch on is, dance around a little bit, and that is the Klaatu is Jesus metaphor. So in both movies, he dies and he's get brought back to life. But in the original, he takes on the name John Carpenter, the initials JC, Jesus was a carpenter, blah, 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 all that great stuff. And despite being able to be revived, he can't revive anyone as that power is reserved for the Almighty, as is quoted in the movie. And then in the remake, Klaatu literally walks on water. He collects 2 of every animal for arcs around the world, and a plague of locusts come to destroy the earth. Obviously, in the second movie, the religious angle is pushed really, really hard. And the first one is there. And it's sort of interesting reading back to it about how, was it the writer Edmund North who was kind of slipping these things in? Yeah, it sort of seems that way. But also both Robert Wise and the writer Edmund North kind of didn't like that that power is reserved for the Almighty line, yet they were kind of forced to put it in there by the censors because the movie was seeming too liberal for them, and they needed some good old religious propaganda put in, all that sort of stuff. So it's sort of interesting to see how both of these movies really are a Christ allegory film, and Brody, as a writer, I'm sure you can recognize immediately when you're noticing the different story archetypes are popping up in movies, where very often you can be like, oh, okay, I know exactly what movie this is. This is the Christ archetype. This is the forgetting what the famous one is, the hero's journey one, all that sort of stuff, where I'm sure you're able to kind of spot that from a mile away.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it works to different levels in both films. I think it was a little heavy-handed in the second one, or just less subtle. But, and I mean, to your point, especially back in the 50s, I think that's something that the religious fervor was a lot stronger back then, even though it wasn't as kind of pushed in the narrative. It's definitely something that I think they would have wanted to work in.
I'll be honest, I didn't really put together the JC John Carpenter thing.
I heard you chuckle.
Well, when I heard John Carpenter, I won't lie, I just thought of, there's an Elvis movie where his character's name is John Carpenter. I'm like, oh, hey, that's the same name. That's fun. That's where my mind went. I didn't even think about the JC thing. But there's a really good comparison to The Matrix, I think, which is funny.
Oh, yeah.
It's all Keanu. Like, that is in many ways, a very heavy-handed sci-fi Jesus Christ allegory film, right?
Well, especially the ending of the one.
Yeah, exactly. Like, everything, and the Wachowskis are very clear about that. Like, this is the Bible. Like, we are telling the story of that. But when you compare the two, like, that's the thing I find kind of interesting about it, is like, there's nothing wrong with being heavy-handed in a way when it comes to this type of an allegory, but there is a clever and intelligent way of doing it, a la The Matrix, and then there's this way of doing it, which is not as sharp. It's not as elegant, basically. And we keep coming back to it, but it really does just come down to the writing of why it misses that point. But it's not to say that it can't be done well. Like, it's not to say that heavy-handed Christian themes can't be done well, because we've seen it done well many, many times, especially in sci-fi. Sci-fi is such a good genre for that type of film. Or that type
it
of
also
story,
seemed
rather.
like we were in that era of the late 2000s, early teens, where there was quite a few, popular sci-fi movies being made that were very strong religious films. So it's no surprise that this was, I don't know if it was following in the trend or not. It just, once again, the subtlety would have made things a lot better. Like there's this scene where we notice that animals are going into these glowing orbs, and we see, 2 squids in one, and they're like, is that the aliens? Like, no, those are squids. And then they go, it's like they're making an ark or something. And it's like, if you have cut that line out completely, which is hilarious, because like about 5 minutes before, when we first start seeing the animals approaching the orbs, my wife turns to me and goes, oh yeah, it's Noah's Ark that they're doing.
Yeah.
And then sure enough, we get that line and we look at each other and we both roll our eyes, because it was so funny that that's exactly what they're doing. And they had to spell it out, because they couldn't just let it be that we were seeing 2 animals go into the glowing orb. We had to know, oh, by the way, this is Noah's Ark, in case you did not know by now.
It's terrible when movies do that. I mean, like, that's something, Dakota, you and I talk about that a lot with like different movies, that just feel the need to be so exposition heavy, and just like talking down to an audience like we are that stupid. But I always wonder, is there a reason that they do it? Not just because they think the audience is stupid, but there must be a reason that the studios have all of them have agreed, like, oh, we need to spell these things out. Like, I wonder in test audiences when they got, there was like a line that it didn't include that line, and then test audiences came back and were like, I don't really get it. Was it? No, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, maybe people do need that. Maybe people do need that push. I don't know. Because we watch a lot of movies. I'll say that. Mm-hmm. Like, between the three of us, we watch more than the average bear. So maybe for us, it's more of like, just stop it. Whereas other people would be like, no, I'm very happy to have that clarification.
I think it's got to do more with the Hollywood thing and how they're looking for as mass an audience as there is. And so sometimes maybe in a foreign market or other markets that aren't as predominantly Christian,
yeah, that's true.
It maybe goes that way, because I think any blockbuster, and I don't mean to dump on blockbusters because not all of them do it, but if you look at the writing or dialogue or stuff in blockbusters, they tend to be the ones that are a lot more exposition heavy in that kind of thing, so that it's perfectly clear to the audience, because they are trying to market to as mass an audience, whereas more indie films, smaller films, you either get it or you don't. And I think that's the intention a lot of the time, is that it's more constricted to the art, whereas the blockbusters and that are more focused on being a product, and the product has to hit certain notes or at least be relatable in a massive way.
Yeah, it was just so heavy-handed, unfortunately. And, I rolled my eyes a couple times in the original one with some of the religious metaphors, and maybe that's just more of a me thing. But the second one, the remake, was just so heavy-handed. And, the scene of him walking on water, something like that, where it's just like, oh my God, really? Is that what we're doing right now? It was just a little too much for me. But I do agree with you, Rachel. I thought there was, some early scenes, especially when Klaatu is being interrogated and he's being hooked up to the lie detector machine. And I'm like, oh, we're watching The Matrix. This is Neo. In fact, there's also like the way the movie opened up, I thought I was watching Arrival too, because it really sort of felt like Arrival. Did either of you sort of get that vibe?
Actually, no. No, if I think about it, then yes. But when I was watching it, I didn't think that. When I was watching it, I just kind of thought of like, that's just how alien movies work. Like, that's just, I don't know. That to me is like, if you watch an alien movie, that's kind of generally how it goes. But now that I think about it, yes, it does feel very Arrival.
Like the whole Jennifer Connelly character felt a lot like Amy Adams to me.
Yeah, Amy Adams, another person who could have been in this role, and
right,
probably would have been the same. We could name every actress in Hollywood around that age group, and they would have done the same. But no, now that I think about it, there is an Arrival-y thing to it. But admittedly, at the time, I don't think I thought that.
That's fair. All right. Well, do either of you have any other similarities you wanna bring up, Brody? I think you had a couple, so we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I mentioned the two kids, and also the chalkboard scene, I think, was used to kind of show how Klaatu was essentially not trying to be, but I guess in his own world, he would have been more of a man of science and was turning to science. So as much as there was the religious aspect, there was also this heavy message of, we need to trust the science and the experts, which let's not go down that path these days. But that was very much involved, right? Like he was reaching out, like that's the people he was trying to reason with, to tell everybody else that, no, this is what we have to do. This is what has to happen. In both films, they kind of use those as the linchpin to say, you guys have to be the impetus for change, because nobody's going to listen to anybody else.
Yeah, I think that's a really pivotal scene, and maybe one that isn't actually highlighted enough as far as character development goes, because if you think about it, how often do we see this, either trope or in real life of scientists or experts being ignored, as you stated there, Brody? And so if Klaatu was, say, the elected leader of his people, or if he was the general of his people, or whatever it was, and came there, usually you find a character will agree with someone who already has similar viewpoints to them. So when he comes and he says, oh, I want to talk to your world leaders, and the world leaders don't want to talk to him, and they're like, okay, who is the most important person in the world? And both times they bring them to a world-leading scientist who just so happens to work with the main character, conveniently enough. And he goes, great, I can talk to this person. They'll understand me. And they do this scene where he goes up to their work, which is written on a blackboard, and are trying to figure out some sort of quantum physics equation of some sort. And he kind of corrects it mildly. And the scientist realizes that he knows what he's talking about and that they can trust each other. And that it's sort of this nice... It's one of these things where, like, we were talking about the religious stuff being way too overt and not subtle enough. And in this point, as far as the science aspect goes, I almost wonder if that should have been played up a little bit more because it was so subtle. I wonder if people even were catching on to what this character development actually was.
That's a good point. I think, like, I always like the chalkboard thing. Like, I think of, like, Good Will Hunting. Where things like that. Like, I always like the idea of using... the chalkboard trope. Is that a chalkboard trope? Is that a thing? I don't know. But the idea of using that as something that is very, very suggestive, but very, very subtle. I don't know if they should have played it up more, though. I actually kind of like how quiet it is, but I think in the 2008 version in particular, when you compare it to all of the other very elaborate moments that they have in the movie, then it absolutely does get lost amongst the whole thing. And I think by 2008, then people are you're kind of waiting to see if they recreate that scene, because that was such an important scene in the 1951 version. And I think in the 1951 version, I do think it really does stand out. And so I wonder if by 2008, if you're familiar with the original, you're like kind of waiting for that scene. But for the writers, that's just a thing that they felt like they had to include versus actually including it as a more fluid part to the storyline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so.
Was that all your similarities you had there, Brody, or do you have anything else you want to bring up?
I mean, core, like, just basically how he served and just kind of stood still, and they didn't do it maybe because they didn't have the effects. But they mentioned that they encased him in something in the original one. Mm-hmm. And then in the modern one, they literally encase him in the stuff and bring him into, some kind of containment center where they keep trying to experiment on him. Obviously, it doesn't work or go well, but... And speaking of performances, I just thought that was funny. It was just a random thing because the last movie we talked about when I was on was the A24 movie there, and Kyle Chandler was a terrible person in that, and he was also not a great guy in this. So that was just more of a personal observation where it's like, this poor guy just doesn't play nice people.
Yeah, that was his whole shtick for the longest time was, being the douchey guy.
Yeah.
And I think it was until Friday Night Lights ended that he's been able to kind of play more of the nice dad character since then.
Yeah.
Rachel, what about you? Do you have any other similarities you want to bring up?
Not really. I think you guys covered most of it. I do think like the 2008 version does a good job of keeping a lot of the touchstones of the first one and like keeping the general spirit of the first one. Remaking that kind of general spirit into their version, but also forming a film that is very different at the same time. Like I actually think the two movies are quite different to each other, especially when we're considering that they're remakes, that the 2008 version is a remake. But I think that they do keep the stuff that they do decide to keep. I think they've picked very well, like which aspects they're going to bring forward. So no, I don't have any more, but I do think the similarities are well chosen by Derrickson and family.
All right, well, we're going to take a short break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about some differences.
Why have you come to our planet?
Your planet.
I need to know what's happening.
If the human race dies, the Earth survives.
We can change.
The decision is made.
You could stop this if you wanted to.
The process has begun.
Okay. Where's it heading?
Everywhere.
Let's light this thing up.
Hey, guys!
All right, so let's talk about some differences. And I think the main one for me is the overall themes and fears of the films. In the original, it was made at the height of the atomic fear and Cold War tensions. Well, the newer one is more about environmental-based fears. And I think there's two very interesting ways to approach the movies. And I actually think it's the probably the best part of the new one. And, it ties back to the line I said earlier that, if humans kill the planet, humans die. But if humans die, the planet will still live. And I think that that's a great one, and one that, like, I think environmentalists are still trying to get the point across, and people still aren't getting it. It's like, look outside today where, any given place in the world, there's record temperatures being broken and insane weather phenomena happening all the time now, whether it's, floods, snowstorms, tornadoes, what have you, all that sort of stuff. So obviously since 2008, things have not gotten better. In fact, they've gotten significantly worse, you can easily say. But it was something that I think was a great point to make the basis of the film compared to something like The Happening, where, the trees are trying to kill people, or rather Mark Wahlberg specifically. But I thought that was really good because, comparing the atomic fears versus the environmentalism are two great ways to sort of ground your sci-fi movie in reality.
I think it's a great adaptation. Like, I think the way that they changed it, because if you kept the same concerns of 1951 to today, I don't think that those concerns have necessarily gone away. But it's like it's a different world now, right? Like, it's a very, very different world that we live in today than it was in 1951. So I think they did a great job of saying, like, let's update this, almost like, let's modernize. What is the main issue concerning us, especially as a planet, like, not just as an individual country, which the 1951 version is more about, one specific country. When you talk about or I guess two specific countries, whereas this one is more of a universal issue, or it should be considered a universal issue. So I think it was a great decision for them to change it. And I think the environment seems like an obvious choice in many ways, but maybe in 2008 it wasn't that obvious. Today it's obviously very, very obvious. But yeah, I think it was a really well done. Adaptation is the word I keep using, but that's the only word I can think of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if you were going to modernize it, that was the only way that made any sense. Because, to be honest, like, the nuclear fear, all that stuff is, although with the war and Russia and stuff right now people, God knows what's going on there some days, it's still not the same as the environmental crisis, which I think everyone can kind of look at and say, oh yeah, this is something that is very easy to frame in the context of humanity, as opposed to, like Rachel said, where the Cold War is more just a couple countries.
Yeah, and if you look at the sort of the dates of things, the original film, 1951, when it came out, it was just 6 years removed from the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so obviously that's where the nuclear fears were coming from, but those were bombs that were dropped from planes. Whereas in the film, they're talking about how humans are building rockets with nuclear weapons. So at that time, you have people like in World War II, the V2 rockets that were being built that were trying to be made with nuclear capabilities, and obviously they weren't successful, or they were never able to, thankfully, use them against people. But then, the scientists behind that were scooped up by both the Americans, by NASA, and the Russian space agency as well, because people like Werner von Braun, who invented the V2 rocket, were then just made in charge of the NASA program as far as building rocket ships. And so that's sort of this fear of, what if we take one of these NASA rockets and strap an atomic bomb to it? Then what happens? And then how does the whole planet get destroyed? What if they decide to actually blow up the moon or something ridiculous like that because, the idiotic U.S. military or whatever it is? And so I think the themes work really well as far as what was really happening at the time. And it's easy to look back and sort of almost view it as a historical document of, like, yeah, this is the reality. This is what, people were concerned about at the time, stuff like doing drills in schools of, like, telling kids to hide under their desks. Like, that's going to do anything to stop an atomic bomb from, completely vaporizing your entire school and town, sort of thing.
It's very in keeping with what audiences' fears were, wasn't it? Because, like, I also think we've seen enough up to 2008. It's like, you've seen enough movies, we've seen enough news stories about, big explosions, that kind of thing, that I feel like we're almost a bit numb to it by that point. Mm-hmm. And so if you did it again in this movie, it's like, yeah, okay, It's just another. It's so silly. Oh, it's just another nuclear bomb. No big deal. But the environment, like you kind of go the other way and kind of flip it to something seemingly less intense, because it's a slow burn, literally the burn of the effect of what's going on in the world to humanity. It's a much longer process, whereas, but that's kind of has a bit more of an impact almost because. Yeah, I think we're just a bit numbed to that idea of like, oh, the world's going to explode because of a bomb. Whereas saying the world is slowly chipping away because of what we're doing to it, in terms of killing the environment, that has a bit more of a present feel. And I think for people in particular, it's like you can feel that more in your day to day versus an atomic bomb seems something, at least for us right now in like 2023, it doesn't feel like something that is like an immediate concern to us. Whereas in 1951, I can assume that because it was such a new thing at the time, this idea, that it was very, very scary that some person or some country could have power like that. Whereas today we're like, well, every country has the power to do that. So whatever, if we're going to blow each other up, we're going to blow each other up. Maybe that's just me. I don't know.
Like one of the writing scenes I really liked was when Klaatu first goes to the kind of rent the room. The next morning when they're having breakfast and they're having that conversation and reading the paper, I think that tells you all you need to know about the fears and sounds like a very real conversation that could have been had at that time, right? Because they say, oh, they will, like they don't say Russia explicitly or the Soviets, I guess, back then explicitly, but it was, there was no subtlety to who they were talking about or how they were going to attack the States. And so I think, like you said, it's almost like a time capsule. This was very much what was going on then versus in 2008. Like you said, there was conflicts obviously going on in Iraq and Iran and that kind of stuff. But the idea that, we're just going to start launching nukes at each other was not that sort of ever-present thing that it was in the 50s during the height of the Cold War.
And then another difference that I want to highlight is the reveal that Klaatu is an alien is done very differently. In the original, Klaatu tries to integrate with society to judge mankind, and the young boy is not believed when he accuses the mystery man of being an alien. In the remake, Jennifer Connelly creates first contact and actually helps him escape the military holding, so we know right from the get-go that she knows who he is, and it's the young boy who the reveal comes to later on. So it's just very different ways to sort of plot out a relationship, because this is sort of like the essence of doing this remake of telling a story where you can decide to, when you reveal your character of what their true intentions are and who they really are, and who they reveal it to says a lot about how you want your story to be told. And I just thought it was very interesting. Obviously, I'm biased because I think the first one is so much better. So I really like the way the reveal happened, and I think it's organic. This idea of a young kid who is naive to the world is the only one who's able to sort of see reality. I sort of think of something like Miracle on 34th Street, where the little girl is the only one that believes that Santa is really real. Sort of something like that, where the adults are too jaded and don't have the ability to look past themselves to understand what's going on. And we get this really great reveal in the original film when they, as the title suggests, the day the Earth stood still. He freezes time, basically all electronic machines for 30 minutes. I love
that scene.
And Klaatu, yeah, it's so good. Klaatu and Helen get stuck in an elevator together, and he goes, well, I guess it's 12 o'clock now. And she looks at her watch, goes, yeah, it's 12 o'clock. And he's like, well, I guess we're going to be here for half an hour then. I'm going to tell you my story now. And so he sort of, that's when he does the exposition, and it's done at the perfect time. We finally get to the place where we're like, okay, we need to know what's going on here, and we get all the exposition that we need. And then as soon as the story is up, everything goes back to life and goes, it's 12:30 now. And she looks at her watch again, and it's exactly 12:30. And that's when it's everything he has said is absolutely true.
For me, that difference that you just pointed out, Dakota, is the biggest difference, in my opinion, which is, just the eras that they're made in. 1951, there's such a focus on story and character. And so when they reveal who Klaatu is, it is done in a way that it's just very well written, because that's the focus, because that has to be the focus, because they don't have anything else to move this story along, which is, whereas versus 2008, now we have cool computer scenes and like cool like computer animation that can like make a really nice escape scene and that kind of thing, which they end up doing. And it's so much more Hollywood in 2008 to be like, you know, when Jennifer Connelly goes like run and things like that. That is such it is so illustrative to me of that time period of filmmaking, of like that idea of let's make everything as actiony as possible and throw as much onto the wall in that sense. And so it comes out in that way of when Klaatu is revealed, or his intentions and all that is revealed in 2008, it is done in a very action way. Whereas in 1951, it's a much more story driven way. And I think that, like, for me, the biggest difference between the two is just how they're made, like how the two films are presented. And that's just the era that they're in. But that, like what you said, just brought up there, Dakota, is like the best example of that.
Yeah. And I think it led to the difference in the behind the scenes. Like, we've never told really what planet they're from, but the reveal that in the remake, basically Keanu Reeves, Klaatu is like a clone sort of thing, right? Like they've been here before, and then you get James Wan, which was cool. And he's been there hanging out for 70 years or whatever, watching humans as a species, right? So they tried to add more of that, where it's like, I guess, more depth to those characters in a sense. I don't know how well it worked, but it tried to expand that world a bit compared to the original, where it's just, oh, we've been watching you from afar.
I like that. I like that little conversation between the two of them. I actually thought that was really nicely done. Of like James Wan character, was it Mr. Wu? I think he's like, yeah, it's just bad here. Like it's been fun, but like they're not great people here, and this isn't a good civilization. And Keanu is like, yeah, that's pretty much what I've seen as well. I kind of like that. I like this idea of them like sharing notes with each other in their own. Like, and it's in a diner, and it kind of reminds me of Heat in a way, but in a very different conversation between the two of them. But yeah, I actually really like that scene.
Well, the other thing is, though, he doesn't want to leave Earth, Mr. Wu character, because Klaatu gives him the option and says, hey, okay, you got this much time left. You should pack up your belongings and go. And he's like, no, I'm staying. If this is the end of Earth, then I'm staying with it. So yes, he acknowledges that humanity as a whole is awful, but that he's also built up these relationships in this family that he doesn't want to give that up either. And that's something that I thought was very interesting. And, very minorly, we're talking about, the concept of other aliens on Earth. And it's sort of in the remake version, it almost has like a bit of a Invasion of a Body Snatchers type of feel where, they were able to infiltrate. They basically, I don't know if they're cloning or what's happening, or if they're taking over the body. It's a little unclear exactly how that science works, other than we get a flashback at the very beginning of the movie where in 1928 there is a mountain climber that looks a lot like Keanu Reeves, and when he makes contact with a sphere, he ends up dying, we think. And then later when Klaatu is born, he just looks like Keanu Reeves. So it's very much an outer skin shell, not who he is on the inside. So it's interesting that, we've got this idea of aliens. There might be even more aliens than just the two of them on Earth, and that they had just taken over the host body from someone else.
See, I think of Men in Black. I think of a real Men in Black situation, which I would have loved. How interesting a movie would that have been if it was more about the two of them, like Klaatu and Mr. Wu? Like the idea that, because after you said that, Dakota, it got me thinking a bit about Mr. Wu, and like it's far deeper than I think that the movie intends to make it. But it is this idea of like humans are terrible people, but the one thing that we have, or terrible like creatures and species, but like the one thing that we have always had that well, actually I don't know, because we can't compare it to other species or like other interplanetary things, but it's like our relationships with each other are what grounds humanity, like the friendships, family, love, community. Those are the things that make humans human. And in that sense, like it's a very quite touching moment with Mr. Wu that didn't really compute that at the time. But again, I don't think that it was meant to be that deep. I think I'm just reading. I think
if we had gotten a full movie of the two of them, Klaatu would be the bad guy, because he's the one coming to destroy Earth.
Yes. Yeah. I would love to have seen that movie with James Wan and Keanu Reeves. That would have been amazing.
Yeah. Well, hey, they're both still working, so we
They
can
are
do a
both
sequel.
still working, and they both pretty much look the same as when they did that movie. So
They did, yeah.
I think they could do it. I think they could do this movie still. That would be like honestly a genuinely really cool movie, like a really interesting. You could even do it as like a 2-man play, like just in the diner of them just trading stories and conversations and like having a discussion, like a debate between the two about humans. Brody, write that. That's fun.
Brody, write the shit down, yeah.
Do that, Brody.
I got to call McDonald's to get the rights first. But I'm interested. I am interested.
Yeah. So, Rachel, do you have any other differences you want to highlight?
No, those are the big. My like I said, my biggest takeaway in terms of differences is really how the movies are presented and how just emblematic they both are of the time periods they were made in. One is so CGI laden because so many movies were like that then. I always like the prequel Star Wars movies are the best example of that, where they just didn't care about story anymore and they just wanted more effects and more like explosions, so on and so forth. Whereas movies made back 40s, 50s, they didn't have that with them. And so they were forced to write stuff that was actually interesting. That was a lot more character driven because they didn't have the effects that we have today. And I think both this particular remake is a really, really nice example of that, especially given the genre that they're in.
And that ties into the ending huge too, because at the ending of the modern one, like it literally is just like this CGI fest of like the world is ending and they're starting the attack. Whereas the ending of the original one is just this really brilliantly written speech, kind of warning Earth, saying, "Here, listen, this is the deal, and do with this information what you will."
Yeah, I love that ending. That's such a
absolutely
cool,
brilliant.
Like it's just so cool. I've just been like, all right, it's literally them dropping a bomb and then just being like, okay, bye guys. And then they just get on the ship and they leave. Yeah. I really like that. And like, I like that we don't know what they end up doing. Like that's actually an interesting thing too, is like what could have been a sequel to that back then of like what ended up happening when they left. But that I think is thinking of more in a more like 2023 Hollywood lens of saying like, oh, that deserves a sequel. I don't know if they really did.
Yeah. And I think that sort of comes back to once again this idea of show don't tell, exposition, all that sort of stuff, where when done properly works great because as you both have just stated, the original ending to The Day the Earth Stood Still is a monologue, which is quite the opposite of show don't tell. And then for the remake, they do the showing, which is this giant swarm of robotic nanobot locusts or whatever the hell these things are, destroying giant buildings and people and all this sort of stuff and all this things, and it just doesn't work as well.
It looked cool. I will say the CGI didn't look terrible. It looked all right.
It's
there's definitely far worse CGI.
Like,
yeah,
oh yeah, definitely, but not terrible. But just so excessive. Like there's like I was talking to a friend of mine when I was watching these things, and because he'd watched them before, and he was like, how are you liking them? And I'm like, it's so funny because the first one, I feel like that could have been a really cool Twilight Zone episode almost. Like it didn't, not that it felt long, but like it, I don't know if it necessarily needed to even be 90 minutes. Like I think you could have shortened it and it could have been a really interesting 30-45 minutes of television in a way. But then the 2008 version, it was just too much. Like it's so excessive in its own way. And I felt like Goldilocks. I'm like, one is like a little bit not enough. The other one is far, far too much. But in saying that, when I say that 1951 isn't enough, like it is enough. I just think it could have been a cool Twilight Zone episode.
Fair enough. Brody, do you have any final differences you want to highlight?
The one thing they mentioned, I don't recall that they mentioned it in the newer one, is basically like Gort was basically like a police force, which I thought was a really interesting idea. And that they were kind of afraid of them in a way because they created them, and it's like, oh, how do we stop them? And it's like, you have to do this or else. Whereas in the newer one, he was just kind of there with Keanu, and there wasn't really much other explanation other than, there's this giant robot.
Yeah, they give him or it more substance, and again, that kind of goes back to, well, they didn't have the technology to make it super cool looking, kind of thing. Whereas in 2008, maybe you don't need to give the robot life. You don't need to give the robot any sort of not personality, but like a background story about this robot, because a robot is just a machine, and so you can just make it look kind of cool. But in
Instead of some man in
1951,
a giant suit.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whereas 1951, it's like we should give it something, like give it a little bit of texture in order to make it more interesting than just a thing that follows Klaatu around.
Yeah, it's interesting because it almost feels like in the original, it's basically like a Skynet Terminator sort of being, where obviously if you follow it to a natural conclusion, you end up with the Terminator. But in the original Day the Earth Stood Still, they're like, yeah, we kept fighting with each other and we couldn't stop fighting. So we decided to invent some robots that anytime there were weapons or someone was endangered, they would come in and just literally eradicate the threat. And so now we all get along because we have the constant fear of eradication over us, which definitely, I think at the time maybe worked a little bit better, but now if you made something like that today, you'd be like, whoa, that is super heavy-handed and not ethical in any way, shape, or form. How does this thing decide what is a threat and what is not a threat? And that's sort of how you get to the, the natural conclusion of eventually it will become Skynet, where they're there to protect and serve the humans, but eventually humans are just not worth the risk anymore. So why don't we just get rid of them all entirely?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and with the advent of more AI constantly, that's a very real conversation.
Yeah.
I'm getting so sick of AI conversations too. I feel like everything is AI now. It's getting a bit too much.
Yeah, and I think if they remade the movie yet again today and they tried to include that original point, I don't think that would work. And maybe that's why they removed that aspect of it. But yeah, it definitely sort of seems that like, everything we know about AI and robotics and stuff like that, it's just like, yeah, this is not going to end well. So let's just not go down that road at all.
What do you guys think? If you were to rewrite it again today, we made it again today, what do you think would be the main threat that they would try to use? Like taking AI out of that as an option. Would it be the environment again?
Oh, that's so tough.
I mean, it's probably the most logical.
A virus. Too soon.
Oh, that would be very topical.
Yeah. A virus could be a thing. Yeah. Interesting.
Again, but then
I was like thinking,
what did the aliens bring the virus, or where did it come from? Like, it opens up a lot of questions. Or is it, a man-made thing that, we were trying to fix something and something got out?
I would love to see a movie, like an alien movie, where the alien comes to Earth and they are not good at science. They're not good at math. They're good at something else. Like they're
Isn't
good
that
at
just
music
Paul
or something. I've never seen that. What's he good at?
No, isn't
smoking weed?
Yeah, that's just Paul. That's what he could do. He hung out with Seth, or he had Seth Rogen's voice and just could laugh. Fair
enough. Okay. Well, it would be interesting if you have an alien who's like really good at the arts. Like that's their thing. They're so good at dance. It's that's what they're going to bring to humans. It's not science. It's not math. But I like the idea sometimes. As much as I think we all can agree, like we would love Hollywood to make more original stories. I do like that there are some movies that have continued to be remade through different decades, and there's like a different mark on it in terms of the time. Like Little Women and what was the other one? A Star Is Born are the two that I can think of that have been redone so many times. But I don't mind them being redone as long as there is like a modern day lens to it. That and I wonder if this movie, if you did it again, like maybe not right now because I think maybe we're a bit too close to 2008, but it would be interesting to see what the next threat that they think humans, like audiences, would be most connected to down the line.
Maybe it would have to be something like AI, whereas they'd be fearing the creation of Gort, which then sort of brings us into, Planet of the Apes, we're fulfilling our own destiny sort of thing. But yeah, that might be an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, like does it become like a police state, like a fascist thing with all these robots just constantly, monitoring your every move? Yeah.
Which is so funny because like anytime we're talking about different sci-fi stuff, it sort of leads me into a different direction of another movie that's done sort of something similar. I feel like I've already name dropped about a dozen, but like saying something like that, the police state with robots, I'm thinking of a movie like iRobot.
That's it. The other thing, it's so hard to make an original movie now, isn't it? Because so many things have been done. And so we're always going to have comparisons to other things that we're like, well, they did that. And that, like, we brought up The Matrix in this one, like and it's got the same actor in it too. And so, yeah, it's tough. I mean, as much as it's easy for me to sit back and be like, oh, come up with something new. It's also incredibly difficult to come up with anything new these days.
RoboCop was also a policeman who wore a visor.
Yeah, RoboCop, a good one.
There we go. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a great place to end this discussion. I was a little worried when this was originally suggested. I was like, oh man, how are we going to be able to do this? But it ended up being a really good one. And I'm very happy, Brody, that you suggested these movies and that we were able to kind of craft an entire episode around it. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm just glad Rachel didn't ban me for my pick. So.
We'll just say this, next year, if we do the Oscar draft again, if Rachel or I win, we definitely will not be as nice.
No, absolutely not.
I thought there was a really nice allegory I was just thinking about this earlier, right? Because remember the part where Klaatu had the diamonds, right? And the kid gave him like $2. Mm-hmm. That's basically how I won our Oscar draft.
It's true. It is a nice little through line there.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't so much win as I just fell onto it.
Yeah, I made a big miscalculation. Although I will say, I'm going to go back to that. I talked to so many people after the Oscars, and like everybody's Oscar pool was messed up because of stupid Elvis movie. Like everyone just kind of assumed it was going to take so many of the technical awards, and then it took nothing. Like that was, I think, a really big surprise. But we don't need to rehash the Oscars.
It was.
We've done that more than enough.
Well, I was told to gloat on this episode, so.
Please, yes. Keep gloating.
I will not gloat. Like I said, it was fun. I did enjoy that exercise, and I'm glad we were able to get something fun like this out of it. So thank you, guys.
Absolutely. Brody, I got one last question for you. Are you doing anything for October 17th? Does that date have any sort of importance to you?
Not off the top of my head.
No? Okay. Well, it happens to be the 45th anniversary of the release of a movie called Halloween. Would you love to come back on the show to talk about Halloween?
Well, what's the time restriction?
You know what this means, though, Brody,
90 minutes.
is that somebody here has to actually watch Halloween for the first time.
I'm very excited now. I'm not going to lie. I would absolutely love to talk about that. And I didn't want to mention this earlier when you guys talked about John Carpenter. I'm like, there's only one John Carpenter. Come on. We all know who John Carpenter is.
Well, good. I've had this penciled in our advanced schedule for a little bit, and I told Rachel recently, I was like, hey, don't say anything, Brody. I want to tell him live on the show.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I will wholeheartedly be invested in that. So thank you guys for indulging me.
All right, good. All right, well then, leave the people with something. Where can people follow you? Are you working on anything? Where can they find your written work? All that great stuff.
Just on most social media, just my name, Brody Codnam. Currently working on some screenplay stuff. I got a few people who are looking at some things, but with the writer's strike right now, it's a little tough. Fortunately, in Canada, it's a little easier because they're still producing things up here. So I do have some people looking at some stuff, and if anything comes of that, I'll let you guys know.
Fantastic. Rachel, what about you? Where can you be found, and what do you have going on recently?
Twitter and Instagram on _RachelKH, and all of my stuff is on rachelho.com. What do I have recently? There's going to be I guess by the time this comes out, I did a box office showdown type of article for Exclaim, in the vein of Barbie and Oppenheimer coming out on the same weekend. So I went and looked back at some of the other big box office tete-a-tetes, if you will, in the history of cinema. And that was actually a lot of fun to write. So go check that out.
That sounds really interesting. And that was one movie where we did not mention it at all in this episode. Atomic Fears, Oppenheimer.
That Oppenheimer is coming out, or has come out at this point. But that's for another day. That's for another episode.
And I'm going to promote it here for you. I know you didn't write anything for it, but the Asian Cut has been doing lots of Wong Kar-wai stuff to celebrate his birthday, and I'm always for Wong Kar-wai stuff, so check that out as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. You can follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at contrazoompod. What did you think of the 2 versions of The Day the Earth Stood Still? Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.